Hi, I'm Cody, and this is Time for History. In a previous video, I talked about Descartes, and how in the 1600s, Descartes argued that most historians don't actually write history, but instead they write fantasy or fiction. In the last video, I talked about Herodotus and some of the crazy stories that Herodotus wrote in his book, The Histories, in ancient Greece. If you missed either of those videos, go back and check them out, and then come back and finish this one. So the first thing I want to look at today is, was Herodotus writing history, or was Herodotus writing fantasy or fiction? I think a good place to start is with the first sentence that Herodotus writes in the Histories. Herodotus says, "These are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians from losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were the grounds of their feud." So Herodotus has 2 points, 2 purposes in writing the Histories. First, he wants to create a record of what happened. And second, he wants to figure out why it happened. This is important because it tells us that his intent wasn't to write fantasy or fiction. His intent was to write actual history, to keep a record of what actually happened. Now, was he successful at this? That's another question altogether. But his goal was to write an actual history, not to write fiction. Second, his goal is to figure out why it happened. He wants to figure out why this war between the Greeks and the Persians actually happened in the first place. This is important because he's not just collecting a bunch of facts. He's not just putting a bunch of facts on paper and saying, here are the facts. But he's trying to interpret them. He's trying to figure out what this says about the human condition. Few people want war. Most people would say we should do everything we can to try to avoid war. War is horrible. But we end up having so many wars. That tells us either that maybe we really do want war, and we see war as something that we actually desire, but we're just pretending that we don't, or there's something in human nature, something in the human condition that pulls us toward this thing that we hate so much, and we keep going back to it even though we really don't want to. So when we're looking at books, I always like to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. And in the last video, we talked about who and when and where, and we just talked about why. We just asked why Herodotus wrote the Histories. Now I want to ask the how. How did Herodotus do it? What was his methodology? How did he collect his research? Modern historians, when we do historical research, we typically go to the archives and we look through documents, maybe government documents, maybe journals and diaries, maybe old newspapers. We look at historical sources, we look at primary sources, and we use those primary sources to try to get to the bottom of what happened. Herodotus didn't have access to all of those things, so he had to use a different method. And his method was he traveled around. He visited historical sites firsthand, and while he was traveling, he talked to people. He interviewed them. He collected their stories. And this is really cool because he collected people's stories from all sides of the conflict. He didn't just talk to Greeks. He went to Egypt. He went to Babylon. He went to all these different places. And he reported on the stories that they told. So the next question is, does this make for accurate history? Well, yes and no. No, because people have bad memories. And people also have a lot of myths and folk tales, especially if you're asking them about things that happened a long time ago and not about their personal experience. Even Herodotus knew that some of the stories people were telling him were wild and crazy and inaccurate. And at times he actually even says, "This is the story they told me. I don't believe that the story is accurate, but this is the story they told and I'm passing it on." In modern research, we would do this differently. In modern research, we have all of these sources. So we look at the primary sources and then we might go out and interview people. And when we interview people, we test what they say against the sources. And if what they say doesn't line up with the sources, then we're probably not going to include some of what they say because we want to make sure what we report is factually accurate. But Herodotus, he just reported what people said. So he didn't actually use a modern historical method, but what he did has value largely because not only is he reporting on the facts, but he's also reporting on how people felt during these situations. These are important as well. If I were to interview somebody about the 1960s, I want to know the facts, but I also want to know what it felt like for them to be part of this event. What was it like? What were their impressions? What were their feelings? What were their emotions? Because that tells a human side of the story, and Herodotus captures that as well as the facts. Herodotus also records a wealth of information about the cultures and the peoples and the lifestyles of different places in his day. And he does it in a very non-judgmental way. In a lot of ways, Herodotus is like an early anthropologist who he travels around and he sees different cultures. And instead of judging those cultures, he tries to understand. He's like a citizen of the world in that way. There are thousands of examples probably of Herodotus doing this throughout the histories. The biggest example is all of Book 2 of the Histories is about the culture and the background and the people of Egypt. But I want to show kind of a few small examples. One example is when Herodotus was writing about Thrace. He says, "When a child is born, all of its kindred sit around about it in a circle and weep for the woes it will have to undergo now that it has come into the world, making mention of every ill fate that comes to the lot of humankind. When on the other hand a man has died, they bury him with laughter and rejoicings, and say now he is free from a host of sufferings." It was very different in the way that Herodotus was used to. So he reported on it, and he was like, this is something that's interesting. Another example was in Babylon. He says, "They have no physicians, but when a man is ill, they lay him in the public square, and the passers-by come up to him, and if they have ever had his disease themselves, or they have known anyone who has suffered from it, they give him advice." So Herodotus goes from culture to culture, and he describes the people that he meets. He interviews them, and he talks about how they dress, what they eat, how they pray, how they form relationships and marriages, how they raise their children, how they bury their dead, and so much more. At the same time, however, Herodotus is very biased when it comes to the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. Why did this war happen in the first place? And why did the Greeks win and not the Persians? Herodotus is very clear. Herodotus believes that the Greeks were fighting for freedom and democracy, and the Persians were fighting for tyranny and oppression. The Greeks were the good guys, the Persians were the bad guys, and the good guys won because they were the good guys. They won because what they were fighting for, in his view, was worth more than what the Persians were fighting for. He refers to the Persians and to anyone who's not Greek as barbarians. He describes throughout the book how they do barbaric things, like the time when a king wanted to punish one of his servants. So he killed the guy's son, and he fed him his son's dead body and had him eat it, thinking it was a feast. Or how in Babylon they auctioned women off to the highest bidder in marriage. Herodotus also wants to tell a story that teaches a good lesson, kind of like Homer did. And to do this, he often has to invent dialogue. One of the main lessons he wants to teach is about how pride comes before a fall. There was a man who bragged about how beautiful his wife was, and then the next day he was dead. There was a man who bragged about how happy he was, and 2 years later he was miserable. Cyrus got proud, and he went and got involved in a battle that people told him he should have stayed out of, and he died in that battle. Pride comes before a fall, and even if he has to invent dialogue to preach that message, Herodotus preaches it. In short, Herodotus doesn't live up to the standards of modern historical methodology. He interviewed people and just trusted what they said. His entire thesis was based upon his bias that the Greeks were good and that the Persians were not. He made up part of his story to teach lessons. But at the same time, it was progress, and he got a lot of things right. He attributes change to the actions of people, not to the gods. He sought to understand different cultures and present them in a fair manner. He did his best with the sources that he had to understand the past. And he didn't stop at just collecting facts, but he tried to interpret them and learn about the human condition, learn about human nature. Herodotus is the oldest historian that we will talk about in this series. Going forward, we will see how the study of history grows and develops and changes. How the study of history went from Herodotus and his methods to the way that we write history today. Hopefully you will find that interesting. I'm Cody. This is Time for History. I'll see you then.